survivors, many of them. One thing I have tried to share with you all is how much in common you have with the Jewish people and how much you have in common with Israel. And there have been some statements of late where indigenous leaders, some of them have said, we stand with the Palestinians against Israel. And what this is wrong, this whole approach from my point of view. Remember, these are my points of view, and I wouldn't say anything to you that I wouldn't say as an academic professor. So I'm not going to spout off about what's wrong with people, what I like and don't like. But what I am trying to do in this course is show you how the history of Native people is punctuated with things which other groups face. So we're just going to look at the Hopi a little bit here, because the Hopi chose a path of peace. This is my principal objection to the Palestinian uprising, the Hamas massacre on October 7th, which inflicted torture. And still to this day, they are torturing 240 people every day. And the world has gotten a hold of this narrative. The Hamas is a death cult, and they believe in killing in the name of God. They believe that when you kill and you die during battle, you're sent to heaven and you're rewarded by God. So they don't care about their own life, the Hamas. And the Hamas come out of radicalized Palestine. And Palestine is what we call a radicalized population, similar to the Nazis just before 1939 in the pogrom of the Jews. They have been taught to hate Jews. In fact, when you go to kindergarten in the Palestinian territories, they have little lessons where they show Jews trying to attack you, and you have to kill the Jews. And little children grow up all their whole life learning that they have to destroy Jews, not just Israel, but Jews. As a result, Egypt refuses to accept them. That's why they can't flee to Egypt now. Jordan won't accept them because Jordan's king is Hashemite, and they are Palestinian Arabs, so he can't accept them. Because they're highly radicalized. Egypt did accept the Palestinians in the 60s, and they set up death camps and crazy stuff. So here's a case of a group of people who've been taught to hate from the time they're very young. We have equivalents of people that have been taught to hate, and there is a point to the story. One thing I don't want you to believe, the radicalized view that is circulating in education, in universities, colleges, and I've heard recently in indigenous circles, that the Jews are colonizers and must be killed at any cost. So when you hear Palestine must be free from the river to the sea, that is really a death chant to say all Jews should be killed and eliminated. Now, this kind of thinking toward not only Jews, but to indigenous people exists. So this kind of attitude towards the indigenous people of South America is one in which you kill all the indigenous people off. Now, it started in about 1400 with the invasion of the Spanish in North America and their slaughter of the Aztec civilization. Aztecs maybe had thousands of fighters, but it only took 100 men with guns to defeat them. So this hatred, this genocidal hatred, you're hearing a twisted view from bots. These are fake internet sources that are paid for by Iran, who pays Al Jazeera and other correspondents to present a view of the world in which they say Israel is a genocidal country. The real genocidal ones in this conflict are the Hamas, who are killing the Palestinians for their own crazy, and it is a religious cause. Honestly, the Hamas, we got to keep them separate. Palestinians, Hamas, not the same. So this went on in the native history of the U.S. as well. And I'm using the word native here again because I'm respectful of American indigenous people who want me to use the word native. They don't like the word indigenous, as I said. So I'm being respectful when I speak of their work and not colloquial. There were battles between the Comanche and the Apache for the American Southwest that rivaled the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Comanche were extremely good fighters, as the Israelis are. See, what's happening in the Middle East is that the Israelis, by being under threat, for 2,000 years, everyone wanted to kill the Jews. And don't ask me why. There are reasons. The reasons are the same ones you have. The reason they went after you and I'm not talking about you, but I'm talking collectively as indigenous people, is because you didn't listen to Jesus. You didn't listen to Christians. And in the Jews' case, it was double harm. They didn't believe in Christianity, but neither did they believe in Islam. So when you reject the major religions, those religions begin to kill you. Not much of a religion, eh? I would say that the world of Christianity has improved a lot since way back then. The world of Islam, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. There's a difference between Islam, traditional Arab culture, and radical religious nuts. So religious nuts are Hamas, ISIL, the Al-Qaeda Martyrs Brigade, the Hezbollah. These are people who they don't care about your life. They'll kill you. And they don't care that you're indigenous and that you support the Palestinian cause. They'll kill you anyways because you're not a Muslim. And then you have the Arab nations, which are modern. Jordan, Syria, Iran. We could talk about that another day. But they have chosen to support radicalism. And when they didn't, things worked out better for them. Saudi Arabia and Israel signed a peace tract, as did Egypt. Saudi Arabia and Israel have been working together for 20 years as partners. 1 in every 5 people in Israel is an Arab with a good job, startups, PhDs, you name it. There are universities in Gaza. But the population has been so radicalized, they've been taught only one thing: kill Jews. The same way in the 1400s and 1500s, people in North America were taught one thing: kill natives. You see what I'm trying to tell you in this story? Now, even within the native culture, the Comanche and the Apache shared territories in the Southwest. The Comanche could fire off about 3 rounds of arrows in 1 second. They didn't need a saddle, and they could just tie themselves onto the horse, flip almost upside down in the horse as they were galloping, surround you, and just shoot at arrows faster than you could think. And they took over all the Americans, all the settlers, all the colonizers that tried to get into their territory were just torn apart by the Comanche. It's really true. They were a great warrior culture, as were the Mohawk, as were the Iroquois. There were warrior cultures. I would recommend you watch APTN called Nations at War. And it talks about the ancient wars between the native indigenous peoples. So in the wars that happened with the Apache and Comanche, I'm not an expert on it, but I only want to explain something to get to our main point here about the Hopi. The Comanche eventually declared war on the Apache and likewise to control territory. Most of the wars that were fought between indigenous peoples involved territory, and they were nasty. I don't want you to ever get the idea that war is good ever, even if it was waged on Comanche and Apache, or an Iroquois versus Huron, or on Wendat versus the French settlers. It was bloody, and it was cruel. The Comanche eventually kicked the Apache out completely. The Apache are no match for the Comanche military ability. Comanche would take you prisoner and play with you for weeks before they killed you. So torture, all the atrocities you've ever seen were practiced by indigenous people and other people. Now, this is not just true for North America. Queen Amina of Nigeria commanded an army of 10, 20, 30, 40,000. She's a female general, which was amazing, in the 1600s. And when she took you over with her army, she would enslave all of you. She'd had 10,000 slaves at any point. She would use some for sex slaves, some would be used for labor. But there was slavery and viciousness all throughout the indigenous worlds. The Maori warriors of New Zealand were deadly and bloody. And of course, cannibalism, which came from Papua New Guinea, is still in practice today. And people don't practice cannibalism unless they're paying someone back for a heinous crime. Zombification, where they destroy your mind and turn you into a zombie, still occurs in Haiti. That's an ancient African tradition. So indigenous people all over the world have engaged in war, and war is always ugly. So when people talk about colonizers and decolonizing, they better understand history before they open their yap. We've all been colonizing each other since we learned about weapons. By the way, when did we first start killing each other? 10,000 years ago. Somewhere around 10 to 30,000 years ago, it's probably a little bit older, we began farming. And in earnest, there had been farming, and we began keeping herds of animals. They all date back to that period. And now people had land, and if someone walked onto your land and took your crops, you would starve. So you invented weapons and you began to hack them. And the worst were the Assyrians. This was in the Mesopotamian Empire, where they would make a show of it, and siege warfare began. So what we're going to say is there are indigenous peoples all over the world who said no to all violence, always. The same way Mahatma Gandhi came from India and said, do not fight, use passive resistance. Fighting only leads to another generation of people that hate you, which is largely what the objection people have in the Israeli-Palestinian. Most people in the world that are sane, not the TikTok crazies at the universities, and I'm at a university and I'm furious with mine, but the real people, most of them agree Israel has a right to stop itself from a death cult who's also killing the Palestinians. But what no one wants is to see innocent civilians hurt. They say the cost of going in and getting rid of Hamas may kill so many innocent people. Is it really worth it? Israel has no choice because the 10,000 rockets a week are starting to land. And if Israel stops and goes into a ceasefire, they'll be dead in a week. People think the October 7th end. It is. Every day they're trying to get in and do more of that madness. Now the Hopi looked at all of this and said no. So I'm just going to go through these slides with you. And this is the introduction. And I'll show you how I put it together. And you can see the slide. These are people that are still alive. They live in a 1.5 million acre reservation in northeastern Arizona. Hopi means the peaceful ones. And we know that they're there because they built into the caves and the structures. And so this is and of any Native American tribe in the United States, this is the much we know about the longest real tribe that we can study. They migrated north out of Mexico 500 BC, and they live in the four corners of the US. So these were hunting and gathering a group with small bands. They lived in pit houses. About 700 AD, which is the time that the Vikings were just arising, and the Middle Ages were beginning, what they called the Dark Ages in Europe. The Hopi started to grow blue corn. You know the blue corn chips that everyone eats? Came from the Hopi. Talk about cultural appropriation there. That's a Hopi recipe. At this time, it has this medicinal properties that you don't get in the regular corn. It's kind of neat. So they have mesas. And if you've ever seen a mesa is kind of, it looks like an elevated bit of land. I've got a picture of one coming up in a second. And this is in Arizona. If you ever get a chance to go to Arizona, go. Every 10 miles, the scenery changes completely. It's mind-blowing what goes on in Arizona. So they began to learn how to take stone and build walls, and that replaced these tiny little houses that had been dug in the ground, and then agriculture became more and more important. And so these are pictures of these mesas, which are large flattened with these stone houses that were constructed. This is amazing. This is going on at the time that Europe is building the same thing with the highlights of architecture. So it's clear that the Hopi understood basic mathematics, probably astronomy for navigation, and the level of philosophy you're about to encounter will blow your mind. It rivals anything that developed in the other great religions of the world. So from 900 to 1100 AD, now to put this in perspective, this is when the first universities are opening in Europe and the first medical schools. The Catholics believed in education, and they believed in higher learning. So they invented something called a university, and they gave a title called doctor, a doctor of letters. So I would be called Dr. Chandross in those days, and that's still with us. Now, it's interesting. What's going over here in Hopi land? It's called Hopi land. Many small villages are starting to explode all over the place. And then the climate starts to dry because there's a mini climate change. Climate's always changing. The stuff we're talking about now is the stuff we caused. But climate was changing. So now they started to get together into larger villages. And these are the names of the real villages. And so these are really, really big, where you suddenly find populations coming together. And then the Kachina cult begins. No one knows where it began, but there's a certain kind of art called Kachina art, and it's in the Petrified National Park. It goes back about 1,000 years, and we know about 1300, we see these dancers appear. So this is about the time that Europe is still in the grips of the Middle Ages. What I want to show you is how Hopi civilization was developing at the same time European civilization was developing. There's a view of indigenous history that everyone was just hunting buffalo and living in moving shelters, which is very, very true if you're Cree and it's freezing in the winter and you got to get south for the summer and you might need a winter in a summer camp. And you might even be very mobile your whole life as you follow the herds, depending how far north you go. Are you Icelandic? Are you Kamchatka? You know, the natives of Kamchatka, which is a large peninsula next to, it's part of Russia, are almost identical to the Hopi and many others. And I'll show you some video of that next week, of the Kamchatka spirit dance. So they're in Russia, and you know, everyone crossed over the Bering Strait. So you have brothers and sisters all over the world as indigenous people all throughout Russia as well. Very amazing stuff. So this Kachina art starts appearing in about 1300. Now, in the late 1200s, a drought really hits. 36 of 47 villages have to be abandoned. There was only 11 villages growing in size, taking in whoever was left over, and they were established about 70 miles from Flagstaff. Flagstaff is near the Grand Canyon. It is mind-blowing there. I've been there twice, and honestly, you will have a spiritual experience. If you ask the Creator for guidance, the Arizona will not disappoint. There's caves you can go in. There's artistic cities. There's mesas and panoramas and forests and huge mountains, 10,000 feet high. Absolutely incredible. So this is the setting where they are. So the Hopis had located their village on mesas up above the ground, but the land surrounded was now used by the tribes, and they started using it for spiritual ceremonies. By the 16th century, you had a highly developed civilization with a ceremonial cycle, complex social organization, and they had a trade network that went all the way down into Mexico. Pretty wild, eh? I don't know how many of you knew this, but this is really, really exciting stuff. Got to remember, everything's different if you're not living in a place that's freezing all winter and warm in the summer, and it's not filled with mosquitoes and bugs and hornets and wasps. If you're in desert settings where it's warm, Arizona's warm all the time, very different civilizations begin to grow. And they don't have some of the hazards in the desert other than lack of water that they might in the Amazon, where you can get bitten by 100 types of creatures. Now, this is, again, very similar to what we know was true in northern North America, up around Nantucket, Cape Cod, near Squanto. This is where the indigenous people were that received the pilgrims. Hopi society was matrilineal. Same thing. It's female. Women determine the inheritance and the social status. When a man marries, the children from the relationship become member of the wife's clan or family. There's a complete cycle of traditional ceremonies, and they follow the lunar calendar. They've been influenced a little bit by Christianity, but not too many have become total Christians. Remember, I told you that I don't believe in culture because culture always changes. Culture is what people do. So traditional indigenous culture, after it met Christianity, took on some of the ideas of Christianity and then started to mutate. The culture started to change. So we're trying to recover the original. So this was a very peaceful way of life. The Hopi never had war. Partially, you're way out in the desert, so you're kind of protected. But two, everyone kind of left them alone. In other words, they chose the path of peace. At the time that the Cree and the Blackfoot, the wars were deadly, monstrous wars going on. The raids of the northern indigenous people on the southern indigenous people on the Pacific that would come down the coast and raid the villages were gruesome. So, but there were peaceful, meditative civilizations that are indigenous. The Hopi would be the one I would draw attention to first here. If we look around the world, the Tibetan Buddhists, another one. All indigenous to the high mountains of the Nepalese, the Tibetans, the Sherpas. They've been there for 10,000 years, but they have an entire culture of no war. They did have armies in the past before they were colonized. You want to talk about colonization? It's what the Chinese did to Tibet. They killed all the monks and put them in jail and tortured them and burned them. And then they took over Tibet and they still own it. What I get mad at, and I'm saying this because it's being recorded, is why the whole world screams at a place like Israel, but doesn't say a damn thing about China, a damn thing about Iran, and a damn thing about Russia, a damn thing about the Congo. And the stories I can tell you about the Congo right now, I will not repeat because I don't want you to have nightmares. Going on today, the Hopis, the Vikings, I think I've made my point. Humanity has a lot of evil in their heart. We are evil, but we also have goodness inside. The Hopi cultivated 1,500. That's 2,000 years of peace. That's unheard of. That's why I love. Now, the Spanish start with the colonizing. They're looking for the 7 cities of gold. Money, 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 money. The Hopi said, I don't know who you are and where you come from, but what are you doing here with your swords and your guns and your crap? And afterwards, the Spanish said, it's okay. We'll hang out with you. And then they learned about the Grand Canyon. They never found that material, but they were successful in starting to colonize the Southwest. Here are the Hopi in their original peaceful society. Now the Spanish return when Catholic priests, here we go, sound familiar, established a mission at Awatovi. For next 90 years, they said no more Hopi religion, only Catholicism. That's what the Hamas are saying in the Arab world. No more Judaism, no more Christianity, only Islam. I'm saying stuff no one else is going to say to you. They're lying. They don't understand that radical Islam is the same as the Spanish 400 years ago. Urshid Manji, you should read her work, is a queer Muslim woman who writes on the fact that much of what people call Islam now is 14th century Arab culture. Modern Arab culture you find here in Canada is modern Arab culture. Go to Jordan, go to Syria, I wouldn't say Syria right now, it's become radicalized, but go to Egypt, go to UAE, Qatar, any of these modern Muslim countries. They have universities, good business startups. Egypt, I work with all kinds of people in Egypt. Really modernized countries. So the people that are declaring war, the Hamas, I call them the Hamas, are the Spanish. They're the colonizers. You need to understand the Jews were in Israel for 2,000-3,000 years. They were there first. Then the Romans came and made them slaves, colonized them. Then the Arabs and Muslims colonized them, threw all the Jews out. They were not allowed to live in any Arab country. They killed off many of the Jews. I don't know, but early Islam was a warlike religion, as was ancient Judaism. Remember, everybody was fighting back in those days, indigenous as well. And then they were colonized by the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. So who's calling the pedal black? I just want you to understand this cycle of colonization keeps going on. And unless we stop it, we're going to have war, and more war, like Bob Marley said. So from the Spanish, it's going 2 ways. The Hopi get horses, sheep, cattle, and fruits and vegetables. And just when it's starting to look, it could balance out, smallpox comes. And it wipes out thousands and thousands of Hopis to a few hundred on the reservations. Now the Navajo began moving into the Hopi territory in the 1600s. I knew a Navajo woman, Sheriko. She was one of my best friends when I lived on the streets. And I've probably told other classes in the past that I'm not your regular academic. I lived on the streets for many years and slowly crawled out of the streets and got my life together. So there were a lot of indigenous people who were my friends on the streets. My first friends were Cree and Navajo. And they were living, and they told me how to survive on the streets. They taught me. It's very powerful. That's why there's a warm spot in my heart. So the Navajo dissipate. So the Navajo are under pressure from the Europeans. They start moving to the Hopi territory in the 1600s. They take their range down, they graze their livestock, and then they start raids against the Hopi. So the Navajo didn't believe in peace. The peaceful Hopi were now having to battle, and they fought for 200 years against the Navajo. Then the Spain recognized Mexico and said, you're one of us. They took it over basically from the Mexican native people. The Hopi lands were now given to Mexico. Now the Navajo didn't have to fight the Spanish. They continued to attack and attack until 1864. Once they were on reservations, now the government said, okay, let's get rid of your culture. Let's get rid of your religion. Does this sound familiar? Forced education, schools, men and boys forced to cut their hair, push on Christianity, incarceration of the great chiefs. 18 other of the Hopi Indians that were fighting for their civilization were put in the worst prison in America, Alcatraz, because they were resisting the forced culture. The group was imprisoned in 1895. That's not that long ago. It's 100 years ago, for resisting to farm and individual plots away from the mesas and refusing to send their children to schools. I hope I made my point. What is it, David? It says I've stopped sharing, so I should be able to come back to you there. Melania, thank you for joining us. I would like you as homework to read as much as you can about the Hopi culture, the philosophy of the Hopi, and I'll summarize it kind of badly in a couple sentences. They believe that we've lived before and we destroyed each other. And then we lived again and destroyed each other and lived again. And we're in about the fourth or fifth cycle of humanity. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks believe the same thing. And the Hopi say, if we don't get it right, we're gone. Look at climate change. Look at nuclear war. Look at the craziness in the world where everyone's fighting everyone for the stupidest of reasons, for land. For land. People fight for land now. Ukraine and Russia. The Hopi philosophy is one of meditation, gratitude, living prayer, and not being of Hopi descent. That's as much as I can say. You would need a Hopi elder to take this any further. My role here as a teacher is to point the way and to get you to understand it, and also to try to persuade you not to begin to hate Jews. And I know you don't. And even the people that are protesting the war now, Israel and the Gaza, most of them aren't hating Jews, but they don't know it, but they are hating. They say they hate Israel, not the Jews. Israel consists of the Jews. If I said I hated Musquishis, but not the people that live there, what would you say about me as a person? I hate Musquishis. From the river to the sea, there shall be no more Musquishis. We'll eliminate it. That sounds a lot like colonialism, doesn't it? So please try to understand that the Jewish people, like you, were kicked out of their hand, have been colonized, nearly eliminated in the Second World War, and now they're starting to spread lies that the Holocaust never happened. They're spreading lies that the Holocaust of October 7th never happened. It was AI generated. It was Israelis killing their own. Please don't do it. I don't want you to be destroyed. But if people around you go and see all of the raw footage taken by Hamas of what they did to those families, don't let truth and history be overcome. The Jews are your friends. They're the only other people you have in the world other than Tibetans and probably 50 others I could name, Australian Aborigines, but again, that know what it's like to have no home, have everyone hate them for no reason, and try to wipe them out just because they exist. You may want peace in Gaza, as we all do, but please don't let these demonstrations all over the world, this hatred toward the nation of Israel that's only 70 years old, the only home they've ever had as a people, please don't attack them as well. They need some friends now, more than anything. And for your notice, I was raised Christian, and I practice Buddhism as my practice. But as a human being, the same as I felt in Ukraine or Syria, Georgia, every other place Russia has obliterated with this hatred, I feel the same for the Jewish people now. I feel the same for the indigenous peoples now. So let's get some love going. The theme of the day, punchline, Hopis taught us that love is the answer. Research it this week. Come back next week. And we're just going to talk about love and meditation and spirituality and Hopis and other indigenous cultures that follow a spiritual path and have rejected the ways of war. And as for those that do war, I'm a warrior, been doing martial arts my whole life. I get it. Warriors are cool. We'll talk about a warrior is versus a soldier and a thug next week. That's it, Manisha. Boom!